The night bus to nowhere. David never meant to take the midnight bus. His regular route home had been cancelled due to track maintenance, forcing him to find an alternative way back from his late shift. As he climbed aboard the unfamiliar bus, the first thing he noticed was the silence, not the comfortable quiet of a late-night ride, but a suffocating stillness that seemed to swallow every sound. The interior lights flickered with a sickly fluorescent glow, casting strange shadows across the faces of his fellow passengers. Something about them seemed wrong. David couldn't quite place it at first, until a passing streetlight illuminated the truth. None of them cast shadows. Not a single one. The realization sent ice through his veins. At each stop, more passengers boarded. Each with the same unsettling smile, too wide, too fixed, as if their faces had forgotten how to make any other expression. Their movements were mechanical, like poorly operated puppets trying to mimic human behavior. David found himself pressing closer to the window, trying to maintain as much distance as possible from these strange travelers. The bus deviated from its posted route, the familiar cityscape giving way to increasingly desolate surroundings. Street lights became scarce, then non-existent. The moon cast an ethereal glow through patches of fog that seemed to appear from nowhere. When the bus finally stopped, David's blood ran cold. They had arrived at an ancient cemetery. With their tombstones stretched into the darkness, their old inscriptions worn nearly smooth by time. The fog had thickened, curling around the grave markers like ghostly fingers. The moon hung low and bloated in the sky, its light taking on a sickly yellowish tinge that made the marble monuments appear jaundiced and diseased. The bus door closed with a sound like breaking bones. The engine died, plunging them into a silence so complete that David could hear the frantic beating of his own heart. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything except remain in this place of death, but his legs wouldn't respond. It felt as though invisible hands were holding him in place, their grip cold and unyielding. One by one, the smiling passengers rose from their seats. Their movements were wrong, joints bending at impossible angles, heads rotating too far, limbs stretching unnaturally long. Their footsteps echoed with an odd metallic quality against the bus floor, tap, 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 like nails being driven into a coffin. Terror warred with curiosity in David's mind as he watched them file out into the cemetery. Against every instinct screaming at him to stay put, he followed. Each step sent waves of cold shooting up from the ground through his feet, as if the earth itself was trying to warn him away. In the distance, a low chanting began, the words ancient and somehow wrong, sounds that human tongues were never meant to form. The passengers had formed a perfect circle in a clearing among the graves. In its center stood a figure in a black robe, holding a book that seemed to absorb what little light reached it. The pages were the yellow-brown of ancient bone, and they turned themselves in a non-existent wind. Thunder cracked overhead like breaking worlds, and lightning transformed night into day for terrible, frozen moments. In those flashes, David saw the passengers' faces begin to change. Skin rippled and flowed like wax, features rearranging themselves into expressions of agony and ecstasy. Their smiles split wider and wider until their faces were more mouth than anything else. David's scream was lost in a cacophony of otherworldly sounds, howling winds that carried voices, thunder that spoke words in forgotten languages, and a deep, resonant humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. The robed figure raised one hand, and David felt himself yanked forward by 1,000 invisible hands. They were cold. So cold. These hands that pulled at him. They left trails of frost on his skin and numbness in his bones. He begged, pleaded, offered anything in exchange for release, but the hands only pulled harder, threatening to tear him apart. A blinding light erupted, and David's eyes snapped open. He was back on the bus, his clothes soaked with cold sweat. Just a dream, he told himself, just a nightmare. But as his racing heart began to slow, he looked out the window and felt that hope die. The bus was traveling down an unfamiliar road, deeper into darkness. When they stopped again, an old man boarded. His face was a map of wrinkles and sorrow, his eyes as empty as abandoned wells. He shuffled directly to David, leaning close enough that the smell of craved dirt and decay filled the air. "You cannot escape," the old man whispered, his breath like winter wind. "This is fate." The bus lurched forward again, metal groaning in protest. In the darkness beyond the windows, David could see eyes, hundreds of them, thousands, watching and waiting. At the next stop, a small girl in a white dress boarded. Where her feet touched the floor, black liquid pooled and spread. When she reached David, she raised her head to reveal smooth, featureless skin where a face should be. David's scream was cut short as the bus lights began to strobe. Around him, the passengers' bodies twisted and contorted, bones cracking like gunshots as they reformed themselves into impossible shapes. Their cries of agony penetrated his skull like iron spikes, no matter how tightly he covered his ears. The bus screeched to a halt before a massive crack in reality itself. Crimson light and thick smoke poured from the opening, and the robed figure appeared once more. It stood before the crack, its voice like grinding stone. "Welcome home." With a gesture, it sent the bus plunging into the abyss. As darkness rushed up to claim them, David saw the truth in the figure's face beneath its hood, his own face, smiling that too-white smile, watching himself descend into madness. Some say that on particularly dark nights, you can still see that bus rolling through the city, collecting passengers who never reached their destination. And if you look carefully at the faces pressed against its windows, you might see David, smiling that strange smile, eternally riding the night bus to nowhere. The last bus on Ghost Festival night. Growing up in a family of educated urbanites, my parents were both professors, and my grandparents were successful professionals. I was raised to view the world through a lens of logic and reason. Ghost stories were nothing more than entertainment, supernatural beliefs mere superstitions. That was until August 17, 2016, when my understanding of reality was shattered during a seemingly ordinary bus ride home. I remember that night with painful clarity. The office had become my prison until nearly 11 p.m., my mind numb from rewriting marketing proposals that my supervisor kept rejecting with barely a glance. 3 failed attempts, each one crushing my spirit a little more. The thought of missing the last bus home had finally forced me to pack up my laptop, leaving the half-finished 4th proposal for tomorrow's problems. The night air was thick with humidity when I reached the bus stop, my shirt clinging uncomfortably to my back. That's when I first saw her, a woman in a striking red dress that seemed oddly formal for the hour. She swayed slightly at the edge of the platform, her long black hair obscuring her face. I assumed she was just another patron from the nearby bar district, though something about her movement seemed off. It's not quite the usual stumbling of a drunk person, but it's more like seaweed undulating in invisible currents. The bus arrived 10 minutes late, its headlights cutting through the darkness like dull knives. The woman moved first, gliding up the steps with unsettling grace. I noticed she didn't pay the fare, but before I could feel indignant, the driver's warm greeting distracted me. He was unusually cheerful for someone working the graveyard shift, his weathered face crinkling with genuine warmth as he welcomed me aboard. I settled into my usual spot in the middle section, the empty bus humming with the familiar vibrations of late-night transit. My exhausted mind was already drifting towards sleep when I felt it, a creeping coldness that seemed to emanate from the back of the bus. Despite the summer heat outside, I found myself shivering. The air conditioning wasn't usually this aggressive. Perhaps it was this unusual chill that made me glance back. I wish I hadn't. The woman in red sat perfectly still, her posture unnaturally straight. But what made my blood freeze wasn't her posture, it was what wasn't there. Below the hem of her dress, where her legs should have been, there was nothing. Just empty space between her and the floor. A strangled sound escaped my throat before I could stop it. Surely I was hallucinating from overwork. I turned to the driver, hoping he would confirm I was just seeing things. "Driver," I whispered, my voice trembling. The woman in the back. "Don't." His previous warmth had vanished, replaced by a rigid tension. "Don't look back again. Don't speak of it." His eyes met mine in the rearview mirror, filled with a knowing fear that made my skin crawl. This isn't the first time she's ridden with us. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. At each stop, the driver meticulously opened both front and rear doors, waiting in heavy silence before moving on. I counted 6 stops, each one amplifying my desperate hope that our unwanted passenger would leave. The cold continued to seep forward, as if the very warmth of life was being slowly drained from the air around us. At the 7th stop, a lonely platform on the outskirts where the city's lights barely reached, something changed. I heard movement behind me, and the temperature plummeted further. The driver's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. Every instinct screamed at me to keep still, to keep my eyes forward, but some primal curiosity forced me to steal a glance through the reflection in my window. The woman was standing, but instead of moving toward the back exit, she was floating forward, her dress rippling in a non-existent wind. As she passed my row, I caught a glimpse of her face, porcelain white, with eyes like dark wells that held no reflection. No breath stirred from her slightly parted lips, no sound came from her movement. She glided past me toward the front door, bringing with her a wave of cold that made my teeth chatter. The air around her seemed to distort, like reality itself was trying to reject her presence. When she finally passed through the front door, it was a complete violation of standard bus etiquette that seemed absurdly trivial to worry about now. The driver slammed the door shut and floored the accelerator. The bus roared to life like a terrified animal, desperate to escape. I turned to look through the back window, my heart pounding. There she stood at the crossroads, her red dress vivid against the darkness, completely motionless. We turned a corner, and she vanished from view, but the memory of her remained burned into my mind. Years later, I learned that August 17, 2016, fell on the Ghost Festival, the 15th day of the 7th lunar month, when the boundary between our world and the next is said to be at its thinnest. Sometimes I wonder about her story, about what happened to her, in that bar district known for its predatory men and disappeared women. But mostly, I wonder if she's still out there, waiting at bus stops in the dead of night, searching for a ride to a destination she'll never reach. I still take the bus sometimes, but never the last one. And if I ever see a woman in red waiting at a stop after dark, I walk the other way. Some rides aren't worth the fare. The Last Journey of Bus 330. A Beijing Urban Legends. The autumn of 1995 brought more than just falling leaves to Beijing. As the locust trees lining the city's ancient streets shivered in the October wind, their branches seemed to whisper warnings that went unheeded. On one particular night, Bus 330 pulled out of Yuan Terminal for what should have been a routine journey to Shenzhen. Neither its driver nor its passengers could have known they were about to become part of one of Beijing's most chilling urban legends. Driver Zhang Wei had navigated this route for over 2 decades. At 48, his withered face and steady hands spoke of countless nights spent guiding his bus through Beijing's sprawling streets. That evening, as he adjusted his rearview mirror out of habit, he noticed only a handful of passengers scattered throughout the vehicle, a perfectly normal situation for this late-hour route. In the front sat an elderly man wearing a Zhongshan suit that seemed to belong to a different era. His vacant stare through the window glass reflected something beyond the passing streetlights. Behind him, a young couple lost in their own world whispered and giggled softly, their happiness creating an odd contrast with the night's somber mood. Near the middle, a middle-aged woman clutched a black package to her chest as if it contained her very soul, her eyes darting nervously around the bus interior. The night air grew heavier as they approached Beijing. The streetlights cast increasingly strange shadows through the windows, creating patterns that seemed to move with an unnatural rhythm. It was here that they picked up 3 passengers who would change everything. The first was an elderly woman in a black traditional robe that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the bus. Her gray hair hung in wild tangles around a face that bore an expression Zhang Wei would later struggle to describe to the police. She was supported by two men, one middle-aged, one younger, who helped her aboard with movements that seemed too fluid, too coordinated. "Get off," the old woman muttered repeatedly, her voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "Get off quickly." The change in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. The air inside the bus grew thick with tension, and the gentle hum of the engine seemed to take on a different tone, deeper, more ominous. In the rearview mirror, Zhang Wei watched as the elderly man in the Zhongshan suit suddenly turned to face the new passengers. The color drained from his face so quickly that Zhang Wei's hands tightened instinctively on the steering wheel. They were on a particularly remote stretch of road when the first passenger demanded to leave. The elderly man's shout nearly caused Zhang Wei to swerve. "Stop the bus. I must get off." His voice carried a note of desperate urgency that sent chills down Zhang Wei's spine. The old man practically fled into the darkness, his footsteps fading with unnatural quickness. The young couple followed soon after. The girl's screams of "something's wrong with this bus" echoed in Zhang Wei's mind long after they disappeared into the night. Her boyfriend's attempts at comfort had dissolved into his own barely contained panic as they stumbled off the bus together. Now only the package-clutching woman remained with the three strange passengers. The old woman in black began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When the middle-aged woman finally gathered the courage to demand her stop, she left her package behind in her haste to escape. Zhang Wei watched in horror as the middle-aged man among the strange trio retrieved it with a smile that seemed to split his face too wide. It was then that Zhang Wei decided to turn back, but his bus had other plans. At the next stop, the engine died and refused to restart. When he returned from checking the engine, the three passengers had vanished, not through the doors, which had remained closed, but simply ceased to exist within the confined space of his bus. What the villagers and police found later defied explanation. The dark red liquid pooled on the floor wasn't blood, according to tests, but no one could identify what it actually was. The deep scratches in the seat spoke of violence, yet no traces of flesh or fabric were found. The stench that permeated the bus interior lingered for months, resisting every attempt to clean it away. The police investigation yielded no answers. The mysterious passengers were never identified, and no record showed they had ever existed. The package was never found. The other passengers who fled into the night came forward to tell their stories, each account adding to the inexplicable nature of the events. Driver Zhang Wei never drove a bus again. When asked why, he would simply say, "Some routes aren't meant to be completed." He maintained until his retirement that everything he witnessed that night was real, though he refused to speculate about the nature of his passengers. Today, decades later, old-timers in Beijing still speak of Bus 330 in hushed tones. Some claim that on particularly dark autumn nights, when the locust trees whisper their ancient secrets, you can still see a ghostly bus following the old route to Xianshan. They say if you look carefully through the windows, you might catch a glimpse of an elderly woman in black, still muttering her warnings to get off quickly. But perhaps the most disturbing detail emerged years later. Records showed that Bus 330 had been decommissioned months before that autumn night in 1995. According to official documentation, it should never have been on the road at all.